Okay, I'm probably just going to get started because this is our only texturing class. Unfortunately, it was hard to sort of get more time to work on it, and we're going to be doing some more texturing when it comes to the environment stuff, so I figured it was not too bad if we just did the one right now. The modeling fundamentals stuff and getting used to the workflow just kind of deemed itself more important, since that's something you'll be doing over and over throughout the next, hopefully, 8 months. So we don't have much slide going on today, which is why I was hoping people were going to come in person, because the main core elements here are all going to have to be from you just experimenting with Painter and understanding PBR in a more intuitive way. So download Substance Painter now if you haven't already. Open Blender, open Substance Painter. I'm going to walk you through getting everything set up. We're going to redo our baking process, but on like a very small scale, just to introduce you back to PBR. And then I'll jump into doing my model, and I've shared that file with you so you can work on it alongside me. So first and foremost, what is PBR? As I was kind of saying, this is usually when I explain what PBR is from like an OpenGL standpoint and what all of the lighting equations are. But basically what you need to understand is it's how we fake our materials to be as close to real life as possible. And we do that by breaking them down into a few different properties. So if we look at an image like this one, the first immediate thing that stands out is going to be this bright metal piece and this dark not metal piece or painted metal piece. One of the maps that we have access to when doing something in PBR is the metallic map. And there's a bunch of different maps for different properties. We have color, so albedo, metallic, roughness, which controls things like how blurry your shadows are or how much reflection something gives off in a certain area. But all this we'll have to explore through actually seeing it on a model, I think. Explaining it is not going to help too much. Okay. What is going to help is that because it's based on real world everything, there is a website called Physically Based. It will give you PBR values for common real world materials. It's an older version of PBR, so they don't use metallicness, they use specular still and internal reflection, so it's a little bit different, but you can still get a good idea of what the base color of certain materials might be or how reflective they should be from here. Okay, that's basically it. Find this website. It's just physicallybased.info, and so you can see I have it hotkeyed here. Anytime I'm struggling with how to start a material, let's say I am confused with why my stainless steel doesn't look quite right, you can kind of pop it open and it'll give you the proper values for stainless steel, right? To get started as a base. So you don't just slap this on your object and call it done, but it gives you a good base that you can continue to work on, right? And maybe I'm working on a tire instead. Here are the values for that, right? I don't know how they got these numbers. I believe it was some kind of fancy photogrammetry stuff they did in a lab, but we will be using their numbers quite frequently. Okay, the other part, and this is just going to be hands-on. We're just going to jump in. I'm going to introduce you to two things in the Painter interface that you need to get used to seeing, and then we're going to explore the rest step by step so you can get a feel for how to actually use Painter. So first and foremost, the only two tabs you really need to understand right now, we'll talk about the rest as they come up, but the Layers tab and the Properties tab. How many of you have used Photoshop? Basically all. Okay, so the layers in Painter are going to work very similarly to your layers in Photoshop, with one exception being fill layers, which I'll explain in a second. But they still have your same blending modes for different textures. So in this case, you can see color dodge and soft lighting and normal and overlays and yada, 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 multiplying. The other tab that's important is the Properties tab. So while this tab is going to handle all of your visual texturing stuff, the Properties tab is going to handle all of your sort of computer graphics stuff. Things like texture tiling, controlling your roughness, your metallicness, all of that stuff. Okay. All right, so we talked about this a little bit last time, but in order for Substance Painter to work to its fullest, we're going to need mesh maps. So we're going to quickly rebake some mesh maps on some example asset, and then we'll get into texturing the car jack. Okay.
Okay. The school has. I don't have a substance license anymore, so my school can't.
Through Adobe?
Yeah, I'm on Creative Cloud, and it says free trial. Because I opened Substance Painter,
Yeah.
your license was expired.
Wait, I think did you went to the tech portal and renew it?
Oh, right, you gotta renew the tech portal.
Okay, apparently you have to renew it through the tech portal if it is not working.
Yeah, they reset it like every year.
Yeah, it makes sense. That makes sense too. All right, well, last bit about the mesh maps. So our goal in Substance Painter is to make black and white images only. This sounds a little counterintuitive, but more or less everything we do in Substance Painter is going to break down to creating some black and white mask, okay? Where we have detail of some kind happening within the white and it's not happening within the black. Whether that's edge wear, whether that's color variation, whether that's roughness patterns and blotches, damage to different areas, stickers. The list goes on and on and on. Everything we do in Painter is realistically going to boil down to creating good black and white masks. Okay, that's it for the slides. There's basically nothing. I want you to get in there and actually start messing around with things, and hopefully that'll help kind of bolster your understanding. So I'm going to do really quick. I'm in the CarJack file, but I'm going to pretend this doesn't exist. If you have Blender open, we're just going to add a cube. Okay? Plain and simple. And I'm just going to call this cube underscore low. You can all follow along with this. And then I'm just going to make a second cube. Call it cube high. And I'm going to bevel all the edges. To some insane amount. Okay, so we have cube high and cube low. So this is your general process for getting Painter set up. I'm going to export my cube low. So I think last week I showed you how to make the hotkeys for that. The settings you probably are going to want are selected objects only, mesh only, no animation, smoothing set to face, and on your low poly specifically, you're going to want to triangulate your faces to make sure it's consistent throughout different engines and stuff. Okay, so in this case, just put on my desktop, cube low. Okay, we're going to take the high poly cube, quote unquote, exact same thing, except it's cube high. This is all stuff we covered last week, and I believe we covered again in the lab. Did you do baking with you? Is that what was last week? Yeah, okay, great. Okay. Then here in Substance, we're just going to go new. And for file, we're going to select our low poly. Okay, so in this case, we can do cube low. There is one additional thing I want to add, just in case you're working on something a bit more complex. Something you can do is make a third version of the model that you don't bake to, but you just use for texturing.
Oh, or it's like different poses and multiple angles.
Exactly. So something that's do pretty often when I'm working on my own stuff is to find something that demonstrates this. Let's crack this open. The other thing you'll notice is these files do get big. I've switched to an external drive, so I'm no longer using Google Drive because each one of these files is somewhere between 200 and 500 megabytes. Here I've got a project I did a little while ago. You can see this is a different object than what I used to bake. including just a ton of different views of the mesh from all kinds of different angles, the top, the bottom, just to make it easier to get in and texture different areas, right? So I can quickly texture this from the bottom up instead of having to put my camera like this and not being able to see anything with the lighting, right? When I have a bunch of small little parts like this, having them all broken down makes it much easier to go in and texture individually each broken part, right? Same with under this battery rail, something you can't really access unless the mesh is separate, right? Okay. So that's the general concepts. With the more complex ones, if that's something you're working on. In this case, since it's just a cube, I'm not going to worry about it, but I would recommend doing this if you're working on something like a DS, right? Have one with closed lid, have one with open lid. That won't be your game model. It's just an extra one you make specifically for Substance. Okay, so new. We're going to select PBR Metallic Roughness Alpha Blend by default. You don't even necessarily need the alpha blend bit, but just in case you're doing any kind of opacity work, it's useful to have. And for file, like I said, we're going to select our low poly. So let's just go cube low. Okay. Document resolution is going to be the size of your material or texture. None of you should be going beyond a single 4K map for this kind of prop. That's like more or less where the limit should be for this kind of thing. Maybe you'll have like ideally 2 or 3 2Ks and a 1K is probably where you're at, depending on what kind of prop you have and how much UV storage you can get. I'm just going to set it to 2048 because it is flexible. It can change later. And I'm going to click DirectX because I want this to bake normal maps and everything that work for Unreal Engine right out the gate. So we're going to use DirectX and click OK. Cool. So I'm going to okay, this is the default, at least for my version of Painter, so I'll just assume yours looks something like this. Maybe not, maybe it doesn't. What I'd recommend you do right away is kind of move your asset browser out of the way, put it somewhere at the bottom. And then depending on, I don't know who you are, some people might like it on the left, some people might like it on the right. I prefer to have my 3D viewport on the other side, so you can swap them. So on one side, we have, it's just like Blender, we have our UV map, right? Except our UV map is also being textured. So that's what's going on here. So I can actually paint on this UV map, similar to if you're doing texture painting in Blender, but just much more complex. It will also show the lighting. So I'm hitting Shift and right click, and I can move the light around in the scene to get a better idea of my model at different angles, and it'll update on the 2D map as well. Under base color, you see we have a default layer here, right? So this is our layer panel. Each material is going to have its own layer panel, right? So each material can build up its own stack of layers, and they can work independently of one another, or you can use what's called anchor points, but that's a more advanced thing we might talk about later. Okay. Up here in the material slot, you can see we've got it set to 2048 because that's what we picked at the beginning, but we can always change it. So I can switch it back to 1024 right now, 512. Something that I'd recommend doing is working as much as you can in a lower resolution first before you bump it up. Maybe stick to something like 1024 and then bump it up after you're comfortable with how it looks at that resolution to something higher. 2 reasons for this. 1, if it looks good at a lower resolution, it'll look better when you map it from further away. And 2, it won't lag your computer as hard every time you try to do anything. And believe me, this program will lag your computer. I don't care what you got in your laptop, it's gonna struggle here and there. So at the bottom in this Assets tab, we have a bunch of different things, and we'll introduce you to them one by one. Don't get too caught up on these because we're going to be building our own materials from scratch. This is kind of like if you're in a pinch. We have the Material tab, which provides us with a bunch of different base materials. So talking about that PBR stuff, a lot of this is already built into Painter. So we have these existing materials, If I pick like copper pure and just throw it on, it's going to give me those PBR values for copper, right? So now I have a base that I can use. If I pick coarse rust, right, I can throw this on and it's going to give me a base that I can use. Okay. There's one major issue with these base materials, and it's that they are base materials. They're meant to be built on, and a common problem and why I don't like to talk about these is because people just throw them onto their model. Okay, they'll just pop in and be like, boom, iron grainy, sick, and then submit. And me or any other artist who's been using Substance Painter for a long time will immediately go, that is the iron grainy subset preset that I've seen thousands of times, right? So you are going to have to build on these base materials. So I'm not going to be teaching you too much about these materials as they are. I'm going to teach you how to build your materials from scratch. And then once we understand that, then you'll know what to do when you start using these kind of base materials, okay? So I'm going to go to my baker, just like I kind of showed in the baking week, and add my high poly cube, just so we have our mesh maps to work with. We'll bake in 1024, that seems okay. Just give it a quick bake. Beautiful. What a high definition cube. So over here, I've got layers and texture set settings. I don't know if on yours it's in the same position, but I'm assuming you can find it somewhere. If not, it's probably up here somewhere. You can find window, views, properties, or texture set settings. Texture set settings is what hosts all of those mesh maps I've been talking about. So if we scroll down here, you can see all the mesh maps that just baked in Painter are going to show up automatically. If you're baking in a different program like Marmoset, you'll have to import those mesh maps and then put them here one by one. I go over that in the video, the async video I posted last week. So if you're interested in baking in something like Marmoset, you can look to that video. Just know that we have it all here because we baked it in Painter. Okay, let's talk a bit about PBR. I'd recommend you follow along at this point because you can just start messing around with it. But to the top here, there's a little paint bucket. I'm going to go ahead and click that. This paint bucket is what's known as a fill layer. Everything that we do to this fill layer is going to affect the entire mesh by default. So underneath the Properties tab, you can see it says Fill Layer. I can't paint on this. So if I try to paint on this, nothing's going to happen. Fill layers are not paintable. Okay? Totally different from painting. We're mostly going to be working with fill layers because they're procedural, which means we can make tons of changes down the line. Under the Properties for our Fill tab, we have a few different settings. Projection, filtering, UV wrapping. I wouldn't worry about any of that right now. Scaling and tiling. I wouldn't worry about that right now either. What I want you to really focus on is these. So this is our PBR maps. We have color, height, roughness, metallic, normal, opacity, and emissive. So depending on the shader mode that you selected at the very beginning, so I picked PBR metallic alpha roughness. That's why we have the opacity channel here and the emissive channel. Otherwise, those might be missing from yours. That's what's happening. It just means you picked a different preset. Each one of these can be individually altered. So if I pick just color, you can see I can start changing the color of my mesh. Okay. And if I disable it, it's going to become a pass-through layer. So nothing is going to affect this channel from this particular fill layer. Do the same with roughness. So it's a little hard to see, but as I adjust the roughness from black to white, the light that's being reflected off the object is becoming more and more muddy. Okay, so a object with a roughness of 0 is perfectly shiny. It reflects light 1-to-1. And an object with a roughness of 1 is going to diffuse all of the light per face that it encounters. Ideally, we're going to have some combination of values in our roughness. to create interesting reflections and shapes when we change our lighting angles around. Next is metalness. This one's actually really easy. It's just black and white. Is your thing metal? Yes, then 1, metalness. It's now metallic. Is your thing not metal? Then 0, metallic. And where the roughness is, I could be wrong on this, but my understanding of it, whereas the roughness reflects the light itself, the metallic is more reflecting the color in a dumbed down sense. I don't think that's how it works exactly behind the scenes, but in a simple understanding, if you adjust the roughness, it's not going to affect the color values. If you adjust the metallicness, it will, because it's reflecting more of the light that's around it, color-wise. Yep.
You made it sound like you'll only ever use 1 or 0, is that?
For metallic, yes, only ever 1 or 0. Very specific cases, when you're more advanced, there might be times when you throw in like a 0.7 or whatever, but for your purposes, 0 or 1.
Can I ask why? I'm curious.
So back in the day when PBR was first invented, we had this idea. I say back in the day, it was literally like 6-7 years ago when I started doing this stuff. We had this idea of specular. So when the light would hit the object, you would have a specular map that told the render engine what color and brightness that light should be after it bounces off that part of the object. So you have to know very specifically exactly which types of objects bounce light in which types of way to get varying like shines. But that's complicated. That's really confusing. It's one of the reasons why websites like Physically Based exist, is to sort of remedy that. Nowadays, the new solution was they invented the metalness map alongside the roughness map, where it sort of handles that specularness for you. You don't need to contribute a specular value anymore. You don't need to say, oh, the light's going to bounce off this part in this way. It's just part of it. So the whole idea with making the metalness map in the first place was that it was supposed to simplify the workflow, and in doing so, making it 0 or 1 is like the ultimate simplification of it. So that's it.
Thank you.
No worries. Yeah. So yeah, metallic parts 1, non-metallic parts 0. Okay. Normal, I'm not going to explain because you should be familiar with normal by now. So it's mainly just those 3, color, roughness, and metalness. Does that kind of make sense to everyone? You get more or less, you could predict what's going to happen as I change each of these sliders. Okay, I'd recommend, like I said, popping one open yourself and messing around with all the sliders. A lot of the art you're going to be doing is literally just playing with these sliders. But once we understand these basics, what we can do is start to layer things on top of each other. So I have my base fill layer here, right? Which is great, it fills the entire object, but maybe I want parts of my object to be a different color. Okay, well, now I need to introduce you to the concept of masks. This is going to be the biggest thing you do in Substance Painter. So I'm going to introduce this side right here, and I'll just mark it with a new layer. Just going to add a paint layer, which lets you paint, but don't worry about that too much. I'm just going to use it so I can mark off one of these sides as something. Let's see. So I'm just going to mark this side on the top with this little squiggle. And this side on the top is going to be a different material. Let's say this is some kind of rubber, and the outside is some kind of metal. So we'll change our property values for our fill layer. That's going to be our metal. We'll make it more of a gray, leave the metallic at 1, and bump the roughness up. It's not going to be a perfectly polished metal like a mirror, but something like that. Okay. In this top base, we're going to make like tire rubber. How do we do that? We need to separate everything by masks. So this is where things get a little bit weird. If I right click on fill layer, a bunch of options are going to come up. We can add generators, paints, fills, levels, white masks, black masks. If you had a black mask, right? It's not affecting any part of the object. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. It's masking everything off. If I click on this black mask, I can start painting where I want that to go. Okay, we can visualize this. Up in the top right, we have our visualizer. And if you scroll down, you'll see mask. You see this is the mask. So anywhere that's white, our fill layer is going to shine through. Anywhere that's black, the fill layer is not going to shine through. Pretty simple in theory. This is where things get a little bit more complicated. Whereas in Photoshop, you have one single layer stack that's continuous, right, top to bottom. This still works top to bottom, but it actually also works side to side. Our fill layers have their own stack, and then our masks have their entire other own stack that are working in parallel. So this is something that trips a lot of people up, because sometimes I'll say, oh, add a fill layer, and then students will just click, right click, right, and they'll see this button, add fill, and they'll click it, and they'll get something like this, which is not the expected result. When you right click, you're going into the context of whatever layer you're already on. So this add fill right here in the right click menu and this add fill right here on the layer menu do two totally different things, which is weird. And I don't know why they made the symbols the exact same and have the exact same symbols in a row here and here, but that's how it works. So anytime I'm talking about adding fills to masks or things like that, we're going to be right clicking. Okay, so if I add a fill here, now I've got a fill inside of my mask. If I change this to white, my mask is completely white. Change it to black, my mask is completely black. Right, and we can stack all kinds of these. So I can have the fill as a completely black, and I can jump in and add a paint layer on top of it and then start painting on it. All the while, my fill layer is still just this gray. But I could also add a paint layer in here, and then a levels layer. So now within this one single fill layer, I've got two layers for my fill, and if I click over here, two layers for my mask. It's a lot. It's very confusing, which is why I kind of wanted you guys to just get in hands-on. You can see this little orange underline. That shows that there are additional layers underneath. And the blue, like the little blue border, shows which part you're on for that layer. Is it the actual fill or is it the mask? So you can see it's changing which one I'm using. For right now, just for keeping things simple until we understand how all this layering works, I'm only going to be putting fill layers and other additional layers inside of masks. I'm not going to be putting any inside of our fill, for as long as I can avoid it, just for ease of understanding. So anytime I do a right click and add an additional layer, it's going into our mask. Okay, you're only going to see orange here for the most part. So let's clear that all up. We'll go back to a black mask. And I'll right click to add paint. Okay. So right now our mask is completely black. We want it to affect our metal part. So earlier I said the metal part's going to be around the side. If I go over to the left, we have a tool here, the polygon fill. This lets us select faces or entire objects by mesh or entire UV islands and fill them in like a bucket tool. So in this case, if I pick face, I click one, boop. Okay. Now this part of my mesh is showing up as white in the mask. And because this part of my mesh is showing up as white in the mask, when I switch back to the rendered view, it's getting that metallicness, right, from the fill layer. We can go ahead and name this metallic sides. Okay. Now we'll add a second fill layer. And this one will be for our top, that's a different material. So in this case, back to our properties tab, I don't want it to affect the normals or opacity or emissive, so I'm just going to uncheck them. I don't want it to affect height, so I'll uncheck that. And we can play with just these values. I don't want it to affect metalness either. And we just have roughness and base color. So let's hop in here and we'll make it a kind of black, like a tire, and make it super rough. Okay. But this fill layer is on top of our last fill layer. So what's happening?
It's overriding.
It's overriding everything, right? What's the solution?
Mask it or change the channels that overrides the thing as well.
Yeah. In this case, we're just going to mask it to keep it simple. But generally speaking, like this workflow, this process, you're going to have a different mask for every one of your different materials on your object or different objects depending on what kind of thing you're making. So we add another mask. So here I'm going to go black mask. I'm going to click on my mask again, right click and add a paint layer. I'm going to go back to my polygon fill tool and click on the top. Okay, so now on the mask, it's just affecting the top. If I get rid of the wireframe. So we now have one smooth metallicness on the side and a tire rubber material on the top. Okay. This is all built in still though to one material slot. I don't need a different material on my mesh object for the tire rubber and the sides. It's all still one material slot. That's the whole reason we do this in the first place, right? We can texture in this way and bake it all down to one material slot, so we can put one material on our object instead of 16. In films, like I said in a couple weeks ago, like they will do different materials, but that's because they're using tiling textures and all kinds of other little tips and tricks to make it higher def. Does that make sense to everybody so far? I know it's a little bit confusing with the whole masks on masks thing, but it will make sense later. Good so far. Okay. I did cover most of this with you last year as far as I remember-ish. So I guess it's not starting from zero, which helps. That's the basics of everything. From here, we'll get on to the real nitty gritty. So if you could please go to Canvas, and if you don't have your own model ready to texture, I've gone ahead and polished up the car jack, gotten it completely ready, UV'd it, modeled it, high polyed it, sculpted it. I basically started from scratch and just decided to finish it. So it's got good UVs and a bunch of other stuff. So I'm just gonna discard. Okay, boom. So here's our car jack. It's like 200 megs, so it might take a little while for you to download it. I went in and made the high poly better. I redid everything in ZBrush. You can see little sculpted details and edge wear and all kinds of different areas that you can sculpt in, right? This is something that you probably want to do on your mesh as well when you can. Sculpt in little edge wears and details, sculpting in the welds for the areas that are supposed to be welded together, like that area there and this area here, right? But the geometry is still pretty simple. It's under 10,000 triangles. So we're going to take that, oops. We're going to take that process now for blocking out the different parts of our object by material. So I'm going to start by just bumping everything down. Right now it's in 4K. I'm going to just bump it down to 2048. Okay. Clear out everything, and we can make a new fill layer. And we can call this our base metal. I'm going to right click on this and add a black mask. Sorry, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this instead. I'm going to click the group button. It adds a new folder that we can call our base metal. Call this one just base. And on the folder, I'm going to add the mask. This just makes things a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to add the black mask to the folder. And then I'm going to slide our base here into the folder. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is take the color of this base and just make it something as obnoxious as possible and get rid of all of the other things. I just want base color right now. Nothing's happening right now because our mask is still black. So I'm going to go ahead and add a paint layer to that mask. You can see it shows up with the orange. And now we can start using the fill tool on different UV islands and meshes. So if I go mesh, I can pick this entire piece here. At this point, you probably really want to bust out a reference so you can figure out what parts need what, but I'm pretty sure this goes like that. So let's do this piece, that piece. I guess these pieces too. And this one. Okay. I guess these two as well. Great. So this is my base metal. This is what the majority of the object is built on. I'm now just going to duplicate this by hitting Control D. And now this is going to be like our wheels. I don't really know what they're made of, to be honest. In wheels, I'm going to clear out this paint and add a new one and change the base to something else that's equally as obnoxious, like a bright green. Okay. The reason we're using these obnoxious colors is so it's super easy to tell which parts of our mesh are being affected. So now if I click on the wheel, I click on this wheel, right? These ones are mirrored over, that's why they're immediately counting as well. Yep.
Why not just change it to the mask view?
You could do that too, but this just kind of helps with the base. It's up to preference. Okay, so that's pretty much it for my wheels. Now I'm just going to do the exact same thing for another section of the mesh. So let's duplicate that. And this one is not going to be any particular part, but I'm just going to call it shiny metal. And this will just be our shiny metal bits. I'm going to go ahead and change it to like yellow or blue. Clear the paint. Add the new paint. And go select all of our shiny metal bits. So this bit, this bit, this, that, and that. Okay. Oh, actually, here's another good reason for using not mask view is you can tell every single part that has something on it right now. So I can tell that this doesn't have anything on it all at once. Okay, so I think that's all of my shiny metal bits. Looks like there's one more tucked away in here, shiny metal bit. Duplicate this again. I'm gonna just call this one shinier metal bit. This part is a little slow, but it's super necessary. You need this to be able to build anything. So that's for the springs in particular, and we'll go with these parts as well. Okay. And then the last bit we have here, I'm going to add another one. And this is going to be for our actual mounting point. So let's call this one mount. Make it black. Everyone still kind of understand what's going on? So add paint, mesh, boom, boom. Okay. We've gotten objects. We've got our mask set up. All of our different materials are created. Now we can start building them up one by one. And there are different approaches to this. Some people like to do the breadth first approach, where they work on each individual material and build it up to a certain point before moving on. Some people like to complete an entire one material before moving on. I'm more of a breadth first kind of person. I'm going to be going kind of halfway through the base for this, and then we'll scooch on to something else. So I'm going to start with the actual core metal. So let's get rid of all of this. And I want to pull up a reference at this point because we are texturing, and reference is super important for that. I'm going to assume I have references. Do not have references. Okay, that's fine. So we'll just Google some. Okay, we can start to look at elements we like and don't like and start breaking it down that way. No. I'm looking for one that's a little bit older. Your observational models probably have some kind of wear or tear on them. They're not going to be brand new. This will give us a good idea for where to start. A lot of these are red, but I think I would prefer to make a black one. Something like this. Okay. So we can see a bunch of different things that we're going to have to start breaking down. We're going to start with the color, and then we'll work our way from color to roughness to normal, right? We have all these little things to do. Like we've got this knurling kind of pattern made up on the texture. It's not quite flat. It's not machined. It's not polished. We've got all this little color variation that might be hard to see on the projector, but right, this isn't just one black color. It's an amalgamation of the heat treatment or whatever was given to it in the paint. So it's kind of got these little white dots and these little color differences all throughout. So just like we're masking everything else out, we're going to start masking out our details as well. We'll start with, oh, yep, Sophie, what's up?
I am sorry to ask this, but I'm trying to install Substance Painter. When the items went over this, where do I get the menu for like the colors and stuff again? I am so sorry to install.
All good. It's the properties menu. So if you just go to like window, views, properties. Yeah, sometimes you might accidentally close it or whatever, and then that's how you just get it back.
For me, it just says properties paint.
Properties paint, that's probably at the top if you scroll down.
Thank you.
No worries. Yeah. So I'm going to start with just the color. And we'll get in here, and I'm going to pick a black kind of color. One thing with PBR is because it's so carried by lighting, our objects are typically not going to be super saturated. Like you're going to let the lighting of your engine do the work. Actually, on that note, there's one step I forgot to do. I meant to do it before I gave you all the file. If we go up into here on the top right, we have our shader settings. And these are the shader settings within Painter. But we want them to be as close to our target engine as possible. So in this case, it's Unreal. So if I go ahead and click this, you'll see tone mapping somewhere. And by default, it sets to linear. We're just going to pop that into Aces. And this will match Unreal Engine much closer. The next thing we're going to do is go to environment map where it says panorama. Just going to switch this to Studio Tomoko. Why? This is just the standard. It gives very intense highlights and very dark shadows. It's very easy to tell what parts of your mesh look good and don't in this lighting, and it matches the engine lighting pretty well. So if you work at any studio, they'll tell you to do exactly this. Okay. So next, this is where things get a little bit weird. Can anyone tell me what this is made of?
Yep. Gun mat?
Painted steel.
Yes. Sort of. Right. So this is metal, right? This is a big metal piece, and we know that metal should be 0 or 1. But we have to think of it as a layered real-life material. Though this is made of metal, right, the actual top layer that we are seeing is painted. So we have to kind of replicate that in our texturing. So I'm going to add one layer at the bottom here. Whoop. Keeps happening. I'm going to add one layer at the bottom here, this base. And this is just going to be a steel. So I'll go to my properties. I'll make sure I set for roughness and metallic. I'm going to set the metallic to 1 and set the roughness to something pretty low. Okay. On top of this steel, raise this up a bit. On top of this steel, I'm going to make another layer called paint. Okay, and this is going to have a metallic of 0 and a much higher roughness. And then we can paint it whatever color. Okay. So why do we have 2 layers? Well, if I go into the paint layer here and add this white mask, the same way we were building up our masks, we can also kind of build them down. So if I have edges like these, let's say, that are all chipped off, I can kind of lower my opacity here, and I can chip off areas that are damaged and reveal the steel underneath where the paint would be chipped off in real life. So this is going to give us a lot of depth to our materials. You can technically do it the other way too, where you put the paint layer first and then make a new layer on top and just paint in the damages, but this way is probably a little bit easier to understand. Okay. I can also go into our base layer here, or our paint layer, and under properties, we can just up the height a little bit. And if we up the height a little bit, where we have our chipped away details, it's also going to affect the normal map and kind of sink it down as if they are literally 2 layers on top of one another. Right, so we can get a lot of depth this way. So I'm going to remove that for now, that mask. And just keep building up from here. The next thing we want to get into is going to be the color variation. A lot of these materials are going to be about building up these masses procedurally as possible. So I'm going to go into the paint, going to add a new layer, add a black mask, and this time I'm going to add a fill instead of a paint to our black mask. This lets you put any kind of texture in here that we want. In this case, we have access to a bunch of different noises. So if I had something like clouds too, switch back to mask view, you can see it's now overlaying this noise texture over the majority of my mesh. And we can use this noise texture and the mask it creates, right, to create different color variation or other effects. In this case, if our paint is something like this, let's go back to the mask. Everywhere that's white, we're going to get color variation, but that's not really what I want. I want it kind of the opposite. I want there to be a little bit of color variation. So on top of this clouds that I added, we can add a levels and just invert. So just like in Photoshop, right? You have levels, you can invert masks. This went from white and black to black and white. Now we go back, we're still maintaining more of our original underlaying color, but we've added some of this new color as well. We can take the noise that we made and sort of adjust it further from here. So I want something maybe like this. And then I'll run a filter, okay, also just like Photoshop, and we have things like blur. So I can run a quick blur on it to just blend it in a little bit better. Make sure this is only affecting color. And we'll set this to multiply. So multiply, blend layer, just like in Photoshop. And now we can see we have slight color variation across our model, right? And it's all procedural. We didn't lay a single paint stroke, which means at any point in time, we can come back and decide, hey, actually this should be more intense, and we can drop it down. Or hey, maybe it should actually be blue, right? We can go just do that. Okay, it's all procedural. So we go back to what we had. This is looking pretty good. We can just call this one our color variation. Name your layers because you will lose track of them. That's another reason we use the folders. So there's one layer of color variation. But we can see we're still not quite on the mark with our material because it also has roughness. Okay, if we look at something like here, we can see there's two things happening. The light is breaking up because it's hitting those bumpy surfaces, right? So that's our roughness. And also the light is splitting off because the surface is bumpy, so that's going to be our normal map. So we know that we also need to make a normal map and roughness map for these details. Sometimes details like these are too small to be normal maps. In this case, I think they are. So we're solely going to use roughness and try and create the same effect. And we're going to do it in the exact same way. Right? So color variation is only affecting color. Our base is affecting everything. This next layer is only going to affect roughness. This just keeps things simple for starting out. So let's just call this one roughness variation. And we're going to need a couple layers of this, but we can use one just to get started. So I'm going to click just roughness, add a black mask, add a fill just like we were before. And then we're going to go look for a different noise, right? So over here is the textures tab. If I click on this little cross stitch looking one, we're going to go find a different noise that might match what we're seeing in the reference, right? So something like maybe this one. We can drag that into our grayscale. Okay. Now you can see how it's affecting our light. So the light is now shining off of different parts of this, different amounts. Where black, it's not shining off at all, and white is shining off a lot. Okay. For right now, this detail is too big. So I'm going to increase the scale and tiling until we get something we like a little bit better. Okay, so we're building up our material from scratch, right? So this is something that these materials don't really do for us. They kind of get us started in that direction, but this is how we can build them up from scratch. There is one issue now, right? This roughness that I just added, I did have to increase the scale quite a bit. So it's now actually tiling Very obviously. Well, not super obviously because it's such a dense texture, but if this was something less dense, it would be more obvious. To remedy that, we're going to lay another layer of variation on top. So on top of our dirt, we have our fill. I'm just going to add another fill with something much larger, like that clouds from earlier. Change up the parameters a bit, and set this one to multiply. And now you can see on top of that little detail we have in our roughness, we're also getting variation within our variation. So this prevents like things from being too obviously tiled, right? When I go into master, you can see it affects the entire mesh, but in material view it's not. It's just because it's in a group. The mask view doesn't account for the group. Okay. So now we have a decent looking material to start off with. From here, we can start using generators. So generators are what uses our cavity map and other mesh maps that we talked about. If I make a new fill here, and I'll just call this edge wear. And for now, we'll just set it to color just so we can visualize it as a mask. We'll add a black mask, same thing. Every single time you're gonna add a black mask to your new layer. But down here, I'm gonna hit generator. And under generator, we can select curvature, right? We baked a curvature map. So now this curvature map that we have being put on our mesh, we can see it highlights all the different edges. And if we adjust our settings on our generator here, we can kind of knock out things like specifically the edges. Right? So you can see it's using our curvature map. Why this is good is it means we can make automatic sort of edge damage throughout. You can see we've got these little tidbits of edge damage that we didn't really have to do anything for. But we can change the amount all over our mesh. So let's call that piece there for now. And then part of the process is just moving on to another piece and doing the same thing. Looks like there's an issue here with one of the masks. Yeah. So the curvature mask is taking a liking to this front piece here, but we can always add a paint layer on top and just paint that area out that's causing us problems. Okay. So this edgeware generator that we made, I'm actually going to put this down here on our paint layer and invert it. And then the areas that aren't shown are what's going to show that base underneath, that steel that we had left over from before. Okay, so now it's kind of hard to see, but areas where our curvature map is showing through, our base steel is going to show underneath. So if I make it red, it's pretty obvious, but white is not super obvious. We could always increase the amount of damage on the edges. And then you'll see more of it shine through. Right? And something else we can do is, just like we multiplied a noise into our other noise for our roughness, we can multiply or use a filter on this edge to make it more choppy. In this case, right, this looks very smooth, which isn't great. It looks too procedural. So we can come in, and after our curvature, I'm going to add a filter called blur slope. Okay, and blur slope's going to make it all chippy and jaggedy, but for something like metal is sort of what we want. So I'm just going to reduce the intensity by quite a bit. We can adjust everything until we're kind of happy with how it looks. Okay, you can see our procedural edge damage here. And we can kind of move on to our next piece. Okay, so this isn't finished for our base, but it's a decent base that we can compare to the rest of our stuff. So now we'll hop into our shiny metal here, which is all these little bits, and do something quite similar. I'm gonna take my base, we're gonna readjust the color, set this to metal, and make this pretty shiny. We'll hop into the shinier metal, which is just these parts. Do the exact same thing. Metallic, super not rough at all. We'll go to our wheels. Get an idea of what we want our wheels to look like. A lot of them are black, but I think I've seen like kind of gray, stonish ones that I like, so I'm gonna go with that. So we'll make these, oops. We'll make these gray. And I'm going to make these pretty rough. Last one is the mount, so I'm just going to pop in here quickly, base, boom, blackish. Fairly rough, not metallic. Okay, this is a lot, and it is a little boring to watch me repeat the same thing over and over again for different layers. So we'll take a little break here. I will just do the whole repeat myself over and over and over again for all the other base layers that we've put down while we're on the break. And then you can come back and pay more attention when we get to actually polishing them up and finishing them off, because nobody wants to watch me make 13 more masks, probably. So I'll pause the recording here too. We'll come back to it in like. We'll resume. So, if you were sitting here, you watched me literally do the same thing over and over to each one of these. The same idea. I added a little bit of edge wear using that generator and just changed up the materials a bit, adding color variation. One thing of note on this roughness mask here, think about the object and how it lived. This is the next part I'm going to get into. This is the base. We're done with the base. Now we're going to get into how this object lived. So this is how your texturing is going to separate itself from everybody else's, is they don't know how your object lived. What do I actually mean by that? Well, where was your object kind of held? Where was it used? What parts were used the most, right? Something on these wheels, they rotate. I'd expect some kind of wear along in axes like this. I've just made these straight lines here, okay, to highlight that this was rolling around, things like that. We can really get into the nitty-gritty of things and start looking at places where mechanical parts might interact. So somewhere around here in between these pieces, we were probably going to see some wear and tear. Something like this, there's a lot of wear and tear here. This is something that you would probably be using pretty often, this garage jack. And every time you take the handle out, you got to move this bolt. So it's something that's going to see a lot of use. Okay, all those little details really add up. And then whatever this accidental thing is here. Just paint that out. Nope, is this even from this? There you go. Okay. So from here, we're going to decide our story on our object. We have our base, we have some damages, yada, yada, yada. Now let's talk about where this object might be, how long it's been there, that kind of thing, right? I'm going to go ahead and say this object's just been sitting around for a hot minute, okay? It's been super used and now it's just sitting in a shop, something like that, somewhere where it might get dirty, where it might get dusty. So on top of our base coats of materials, we're going to start to add all that stuff. Okay, I'm going to start with the wheels just because it's probably the most demonstrative here. If I just hide everything else for now, we'll isolate the wheels and I'll just hop in. On top of the wheels, or rather I could do it on top of the entire everything. I'm just going to add a new folder and call this one dirt. We'll add a black mask just like usual. Add a new generator. Okay. And if I type in dirt, there's going to be one that pops up. And there are other ways to do this, but this is a good base because what dirt's going to do is it's going to say, hey, these areas where your ambient occlusion is, right? These areas where your curvature is, where pitting is, all these little areas where dirt would realistically get on an object if it was sitting around for a long time, right? It's going to automatically do a lot of that for you. Okay, so if we look at the settings here, we can see it's building off of our different masks. We can adjust the grunge, the level, our curvature map, our ambient occlusion map, and our position map. Let's just go ahead and adjust this as much as we want. Kind of lowering it down or raising it up, something like this. We're trying to have consistent level of detail throughout, so we want to up the scale on our grunge until it looks kind of like it fits in with everything else. Okay. Yes.
I have like targeted grunge. I have spots on my model that are like almost brand new. And I have spots on my model that scrape against the ground so often that the paint is just gone.
That's super common, right? All these different little things are going to build up. So I'll show you in a second. Here, let's turn on all the materials just so we can get a better idea. Because we're going to do the fix for exactly that in just a second. So you can see I got my dirt all over everything and it's way too much. There are areas where it's just totally covering it and areas where there probably shouldn't really be any dirt at all. We just have to build our mask bit by bit. And in this case, what we can do is add another paint layer. And because it's set to a normal blend mode, it's just going to overwrite whatever's underneath it. So if I take my paintbrush here and just make it black, we can paint out any of the dirt. Whoop.
The blender equivalent of panel.
Yeah, pretty much. I think I'm on the wrong layer setting here. Flip this up. But we can take different areas that don't need it and kind of cut away at it. My brush is not brushing for me right now. Oh, my alpha's set to 0. Right, but now I can go in and paint out certain areas where I might not want that dirt. There is the issue of we end up with this really hard, rough edge, which we probably don't want. But we can also take this paint layer and kind of hit it with all the same treatment that we've given our other stuff. So this isn't a perfect example, but let's just say we don't want any dirt in there, and then we want to loosen up this edge. Well, we can hit it with a blur. To help smooth it out a bit. Or we do have a smudge tool that we can use just like any other program like Blender, Photoshop, to sort of smudge our edges around and blend them in a little bit nicer. Or if I can do all of that, probably the best option is doing it procedurally, where we overlay one material. So I can add a fill here with like a something. I'm going to set this to multiply. Okay, and it'll only really show up where I paint a lot. So let's get rid of this just for demonstration purposes. Paint. Paintbrush to 1. You can see it's just showing the detail where my paint stroke is. So if I set this back to a nicer brush, it's just on this really sharp one right now. We can feather in here, basic soft brush. We could feather in details in certain areas that have it. So we're going to more or less follow that process, but actually just backwards. I'm going to just clear this paint layer. Clear this. We'll knock the dirt level down quite a bit. And then we can go start adjusting areas by hand after. Right, so this is doing a good job of getting all of our little crevices and things like that. We have it set to a bright color right now. I'm just going to darken this and make it something that kind of sits on top. Something... Oop. Auto saving, actually, never mind. That's what we're going to do right now. Okay, for things like dirt, we probably want to change our blending mode to something different. The dirt is sort of transparent in a way where it's not affecting the entire everything. Some of the original color is still going to shine through a little bit, so we can use something like coloring or, let's see, screen. To just let a little bit of our other color shine through underneath. Call this dirt color. And again, we're thinking about our properties of our dirt and stuff too. So our dirt is going to be not metallic. Our dirt is going to be fairly rough, as dirt is. It doesn't reflect a ton of light.
That's great.
Okay. And now we've got something with a little bit of dirt. Let's do something similar now for dust. So I'll make a new one, black mask. Add a fill layer. Still just using some obnoxious color at the beginning, helps sort everything out. I'm gonna add a new generator called light. So I can't go over every single generator that you're gonna wanna use. You're gonna have to play around with the different ones yourself and figure out what situations warrant what kind of generator. In this case, light, what it's gonna do is pretend that there is a light in the scene, and anywhere the light touches, it is going to mask off. So if I just quickly pop into the mask here, you can imagine the light is somewhere over here. What I want to do is just make this straight down. Oh, I don't have a world space normal map, so it's actually freaking out. I missed one of the bake options. So I'm going to bake just the world space normal by itself. Using the high poly. Okay, the world space normal is going to tell all of my materials, is going to tell all of my materials where they are in the world. So now with the light, we can see, right, it's basically a directional light that's being cast on our object. If we set the vertical angle to something like straight down, right, we can imagine everything that's facing upwards is going to be hit by this light. And when we think about how dust tends to settle on objects, it's a very similar process. So now we have a great mask that we can start building dust off of, right? It's going to fall in all the crevices and all the areas that light would hit from the top. So let's do another one of those blends, right? We have these edges here that are super sharp. Not really what I want for dust. I want to, yep, what's up, Jake?
Sorry to ask this again.
Okay.
This is again more specific to my model, but
So
if there would be a place on the model where the paint was lifting, would you just use like a normal map for that, or how would you? If I wanted to show a flat part of the model, but like the paint was kind of furling or bubbled or imperfect, how could I be able to do that? Would you suggest modeling or texturing that?
that'll be something you do in texturing for sure. We haven't done, like everything I've done so far, we haven't even touched normal maps yet, really. Like we've done a little bit of height stuff here and there, but generally not so much. After we add this little bit of dust, we'll get into adding details like scratches, things like chipping paint, that kind of thing. But it is going to be very similar stuff. In here we use height because height dictates everything. The normals are just a result of it, more or less. So if you can imagine, if the paint is kind of furling off, it is going to be sit a little bit higher,
Yeah.
and that's what's causing the change in lighting. That'll be baked into our normal map when we export everything here, but the channel we're looking for is height.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep, no worries. So continue with this. I don't want this light to just look like this. I don't know, dust typically doesn't look like one solid flat shape. So inside the mask, on top of this light, we're just going to multiply in some more noise. So this is just the process for texturing. A lot of this is just finding stuff, multiplying more noise in. Right? There's a bunch of different procedural textures, an absolute ton of them. My suggestion is you get familiar with one or two and just understand how they work pretty intuitively. For example, 99% of the times, even in situations when I probably shouldn't, I'm using Clouds 2. I just think it works pretty well. It's got a nice balance, and so I'm quite familiar with it. I use it as a base for any kind of procedural stuff. Something like this, you know, I could maybe search for dust and something will come up. Right? We do have a few things coming up for dust. These might work better in certain cases, but they're not always going to be exactly what you want. Let's see. Grunge, wipe, dusty. Let's try this one. Okay. Yeah, already not a huge fan. Set this to multiply. Better, still not a huge fan. We'll take a quick peek here. All right. We'll change this to how our dust would actually be, which is kind of just a white, and then we'll kind of multiply it on top of everything else. All right, and if that's too strong still, we can use the opacity slider to just kind of lower it a bit. So now we've kind of got dirt and dust, but a lot of it is too procedural. Like, look at this just clean line across here. That's not really how we want this to look. This is where adding those personal details comes in. So on top of the dirt, right, I just want to add a new paint layer. Oops. Paint layer. And we'll start to sort of cut away at areas. So if I switch to mass view, it might be easier to understand what's going on. I want a different brush because this default one might be just a little bit too much. If you have a drawing tablet, this is all stuff I would normally be doing with a drawing tablet, but just because of the structure of us being in a lecture room, this is a lot easier to do with the mouse here. I'm just lower the opacity of my stroke instead to kind of emulate as if I was using a drawing tablet. And we'll switch to a different kind of brush that has a little bit of blending. And then this way we can start to kind of come in and break this edge up, so it's not so perfect. Maybe some areas accumulate dust a little bit more than others. Maybe there's little patches and pockets and things like that. And we're just kind of painting away to add variation. I'm keeping my opacity low. I don't want to overdo anything. Areas like that would be pretty built up with dirt and dust. But then areas like this, maybe not so much. So we can spend a lot more time just removing the dust from there. Okay. It's using our baked maps and everything. So by default, it's thinking like, okay, this is in between two objects, so it should be super dirty. But we know, because this is a car jack and that part's going up and down quite frequently, it's not going to be quite as dusty as it might think. And that's where we kind of have to start adding our own tidbits. That's why I really recommended you pick an object that you understand or that you have more familiarity with. Just chopped away at that for a little while just to get something a little bit more organic, a little bit less uniform looking, less procedural. It'll come back. Great. Okay. Now we can start adding things like scratches or flaking paint or that kind of thing. So on top of everything, I'm just going to make a new fill. We can call this scratches and then put it in whatever layer we want. In this case, I'm going to leave the scratches layer just on top of everything. We'll do our scratches for the entire model at once. This might work for some objects, might not work for others. Because this is all roughly the same metal, it should work just fine. Add a black mask, go into our fill layers, and look for some kind of scratches. So I did say that using the base materials is bad. Using these tiling default textures falls into a similar vein, but because you're overlaying them on top of each other so much, you can get away with it a lot more. Right, so there's nothing wrong with using these.
Would you recommend making your own textures?
Now and then, it is pretty circumstantial, but if you have something with like really big details or that are super specific to one area, it's probably better to make your own stencil and do that. 45 minutes. I don't know if I'll get the stencils in time, but I'll try because that's another pretty big component. So here we have a grunge scratch generator, which looks like shit by default, but it will make scratches in a mask that we can use. So we go back to our mask and we'll just start to sort of work through this. We don't want scratches that look like this for what I think are obvious reasons. We can kind of change the balance and contrast to just adjust. A few small scratches here and there just to get us started. And these are a little bit different. We don't want these really to affect too much. Not going to affect color roughness unless they're super deep. So we're just going to affect height. You can see if I lower the height, it'll affect the normal map as well and create these deep grooves. I'm going to have it just affect the height a tiny, tiny amount. You really don't need very much. 0.01. Oops. 0.05. All right. It's better to have a lot of these little details building up into big details than having just a couple. I don't know why it's not making this negative. There you go. It's better to have a bunch of little details like this rather than building into one big one, right? If I just was like, oh yeah, actually, add paint, pick a brush, scratch. It's never going to look as good or as in depth as what our real life objects look like because there's so much more nuance than that. So tiny little scratches like that are fine, and we can layer a second set, right? So we can call this one small scratches. And then we'll just duplicate it. And in this one, we'll go find a fill for larger scratches. So something like this. Okay. Check our mask out and kind of adjust based on what we want to show. Okay. By default, this fill is not using our object's geometry, right? So I have scratches just all over it in different places. That's not actually going to happen when we use this kind of object though. So I need to add a paint layer on top and go in and find the areas that would actually get scratched or would not get scratched and start to buff them out. So I'm just going to use some random brush. Okay, we can look at the mask. So areas like underneath here, we want to think about how would that get scratched up in this manner, right? This is a pretty dense amount of scratches. So lots of wear and tear, lots of bumping into things. How would I scratch this bottom part? I'd have to like purposely run the jack over a bunch of rocks upside down to scratch this, right? So there's no reason to have the scratches here. I'm going to be painting them out. So we go into mask. Oop, I'm buffing the wrong color. 0. There we go. Right, so I can start to buff these out. Scratches in those areas, they just don't make sense. So we'll buff them out. Okay. Scratches on the inside of the wheel housing. How are we going to get scratches here? Right, you might get a little bit of pitting. That's one thing, but probably not a lot of scratching going on there. Scratches on the edges and the outside for sure. We continue. Trying to break everything up. Scratches on like the bottom of this thing. How is that going to happen, right? It can't. So we can go ahead and start kind of removing the scratches in there. This bit here, right? Actually, this whole kind of side bit, it's going to be covered by the wheel 90% of the time, right? The wheel's in the way. So if anything's going to get beat up when that hits walls, it's going to be the wheel, right? So we're going to kind of buff these scratches out in here too, right? It'd be really difficult to cause some damage in there. Same goes for back here, right? I've got scratches all over these cylinders. They are protected for a reason. They've got all this stuff around them to stop them from getting beat up because they're such an important component. So we're buffing a lot of that out. Buffing a lot of the scratches out on the springs and on everything else in here that's meant to be protected. Right? We might have some scratches here because we're working with a contact surface. Buff that out there, buff that out there. This is one of my small scratches, so I'm just going to do the same thing. Buff this one kind of out. Doesn't really make a lot of sense for something to be that deeply scratched there. Something like this would be scratched up. Something like the handle would be scratched up all the way up. We get a lot of scratches in these areas where there's edge wear, but that looks good already. Okay, great. So now we've gotten rid of a lot of that. We've added some dust, we've added some dirt, we've added some color variation. We can look at potentially some peeling paint or something like that. If I add a new fill, new black mask, same process every time. And then we can look for something that looks kind of like flaking paint. If that search menu is too small, you can just bring this one up and kind of look through here. It's very small on my laptop screen, but you can find some kind of grunge, I'm sure. All right, so here's one. It's called Marble Veins, but it does vaguely look like something we could use for flaking paint. We'll just remember this one. We'll take another look, and if we don't find anything else, we'll come back to that one.
I
Yep.
think it's supposed to be on like the generator, the peeling paint one.
Is there just a peeling paint generator that just does it by default? Not sure.
Yeah, I think so. There should be one.
There is a peeling paint in here.
Interesting. I'm going to build it more from scratch here instead.
Okay, that's
So we'll go to our fill layer, add a black, add a fill, and we'll drop in our flaky kind of marble texture. I feel like this works well enough. I'm going to go ahead and just invert this quickly and adjust the balance quite a bit because it wouldn't be flaking that much. This kind of thing, right now it's affecting our entire object, but we only want the paint to flake on areas where there is paint, which is going to be that red area. So I'm just going to take this, call it flaking paint, and scooch this on down. Okay, gonna slowly scooch it down into our base metal. And now it's only affecting our base metal like it should. I'll get rid of these for now and just work with the height. And we'll kind of do the same thing where we cut into the height. And then we can make this kind of match the colors underneath. Something you can do, and I recommend kind of doing is, so for something like this, it's obviously well overdone, but it's better to overdo it and then kind of come back and start chipping away at it. So now we'll come back with that paint and we'll do the same thing. We'll kind of just chip away at the areas that don't need it. All right, so it's a little bit overkill at first, and then after a little bit of tweaking, we end up with something better. So we'll get rid of a lot of it up here because it doesn't seem right up there. Just have splotches of it here and there. All right, I'm still thinking the same thing as the other stuff, like how would it chip in here? Probably not so much. If it's flaking, it probably meant something was chipped into it first and then it kind of started flaking off. Can leave a lot of this as pitting. Okay, pretty reasonable for our car jack. Next, I'm gonna get into stencils a little bit. I will have time, should be fine. So a lot of your objects are gonna have these highly detailed parts, like maybe these stickers or other things like that. They're gonna be kind of hard to replicate in Painter alone. Generally speaking, the process for these is gonna be recreating the textures you need in a program like Photoshop. So I can't go too much into how to actually make that, but that's the idea for a lot of this. If I open up that other project, I can show the different type of stencils that might get made, if I remember where it is. Not those. Not that. There we go. So you might end up with something like this out of Photoshop. This was a stencil I used for that other project. It's more or less just the same thing, a black and white mask that was made in Photoshop that we can use to apply alphas in different areas to our mesh, right? So if you have things like small text or specific logos that you want to use, your best bet is going to be recreating them in something like Photoshop first. So let's create something for this. We don't really have, I think generally speaking, not much gets put on the side of these, maybe a sticker here or there. Well, let's just pretend it's our own. We can put whatever we want on it. So I'll just make a quick text stencil here and we'll do something like just the name of the class. So I'm going to make a black background, and white is where our stencil will go through. I will, I don't know, pick some kind of font, doesn't really matter. Something that looks industrial. Or we'll use something like this, and we can actually kind of plop it into the side as if it was a branding. So obviously you'd probably want to add like a bunch more and things like that, but for demonstration purposes, we'll just use this as a single stencil. Your stencil needs to be square, right? So this is just a 2000 by 2000 document. We're going to use these pixels in our file. So I'll export this as a PNG to my desktop, or ideally you have a better place to put it. And then from Painter, I'm going to import resources, add a resource, pick my stencil, and here we have a couple options. We can import as an alpha, a color LUT, an environment, or a texture. In this case, we're importing a black and white mask to use as a stencil, so I'm going to import it as an alpha. And we're going to import our resources to current session. We'll let you use that resource literally just while you have Substance open, and when you close it, it'll remove it from the project. Project will make it so that every time you open this particular project, that stencil will be available to you. Or library saves it on your disk. So in my case, I do a lot of those Sony products. I have that Sony stencil saved to my disk, so every time I open a new project, it's just already there. I don't have to import it again. In this case, this is specifically for this, so I'm just going to do Project Carjack. And I'm going to do this as texture, actually. Just import. Okay, and here it is as untitled-01. So now we can go up to the very top. And I'm going to add a new fill layer and just call this one like an imprint. And I just want this one to affect height. We'll lower our height a little bit and add a black mask. What we can do here is under my stencil, I can drag in my image, and now it kind of floats around. It's stuck to my screen. We can move it by hitting S. You can rotate it, move it, and it's going to be relative to the camera. Right? So you can see when I paint, it's only going to paint where that white is. So if you have like these high intensity details, this is how you do it. And the additional bit is a lot of text and stuff. It's kind of hard to line up in 3D here. This isn't an orthographic viewport. You can make it orthographic, but sometimes it's just a pain or it's dark or yada, yada, yada. Like, I want this to be perfectly lined up in this spot for whatever reason, right? That can be kind of convoluted to do. So if we punch into the UV port, and this is why I said you probably want your UVs to be lined up a certain way. Now it's going to be super easy to come in here, find our UV, and make sure this is perpendicular, and now it's easy to get flat. If we go back to our swap view, we can find that on our mesh, except I did it on the inside. Hold on, I'll do it again on the outside. Right, you can see this is a problem here though, because my UV is not flat, right? I didn't flatten them quite properly. Do it on that side, there it is. So this kind of like branding thing, I think, is something they do. I don't really know. I'm just gonna assume they do. So let's just pick a spot that would probably look good, where they would do this kind of thing. Somewhere like here kind of makes sense. And then to get rid of the stencil, we just click the X and it's gone. Right? And now we have this little indent. And because we use the fill layer, we can adjust the height of this indent. Maybe it's an outprint, maybe it's an inset, maybe it's barely visible, maybe it's ridiculously visible. And we can add generators and fills on top to just sort of adjust. So if I think this is too sharp, maybe we can go in and quickly add a filter and a blur to help it kind of blend in a bit better. Okay. If you wanted to take this even further, something we can do is go back to some of our dirt and stuff. We'll move this imprint below our dirt. And then inside of our dirt and our paint, we'll kind of paint in between these layers, because theoretically, since we have this imprint, dirt would sit inside of it. So lower our stroke opacity here, and we can just kind of lightly punch in as if dirt was kind of getting into these little creases and cracks. And that just kind of helps the believability even more. Okay. So with that, we've covered mostly everything with getting something done. I recommend you spend a lot longer than I have on this. It's only been like a couple hours. So this is something that would normally take, like if I was to do this again, and I probably will to finish it off, it will take like another week. What you guys have, you have 2 weeks. Next week we're going to talk about actually rendering this out, making scenes and things like that. I'll export this from Substance. We'll put it in a game engine and actually do things with it, quote unquote. It's not going to move, but we can put it in there as a prop. And then the week after that will be environment. So the last little things that we have to do here is just touching up all the areas we kind of neglected throughout. So at the very front, never mind, auto-saving. At the very front, we've got these like big pieces that we've kind of left in that aren't supposed to be there. We can quickly flick our layers on and off to figure out which part is causing what. So our flake and paint layer is causing problems here. We can come in and start removing that stuff. Gonna grab a brush, paint that out. It's just a little bit too aggressive for my liking. Our edge damage here, looks something similar, this curvature bit. Just gonna come in here and paint this out because I think it's a little bit too aggressive, right? It'd be pretty hard for stuff to get in here and chip the paint in between these two pieces, so it doesn't make a ton of sense for there to be a lot of wear there. Okay, something like that looks a little bit better. Constantly kind of moving the lighting around to get an idea. If we have this one print on this side, we probably want to do something similar on the other. And we have to clean up areas like this as well. Right. We can also go in and start faking things like ambient occlusion. So if I make a new one here, add a black mask, there is ambient occlusion already, but we can kind of emphasize it. Add a paint layer. We're going to use some soft brush, basic soft brush, and just kind of come in to areas where things are touching. Just touch it up a bit. There's no right or wrong way to texture things as long as you get that good end result. Something you can also do is kind of just fake the lighting. So I'm kind of painting in darker areas. Okay. If this was stored outdoors, we would start to think about like, hey, maybe we're going to include some rust in certain areas. If this was stored upside down, then the whole process would be different. We'd have the lights go from the other direction, all that kind of stuff, right? You really got to think about where this prop is in its life cycle and how it's been treated to get a good result. So when we think we're done, we're going to do a quick check of all of our different rules here. So one is our base color. We know that we should not have super saturated colors because then that kind of defeats the purpose of having a engine that lights things. So here we have pretty desaturated colors. We're probably good in this department. In our roughness map, we're usually not working with values between 0 and 1. We're in some kind of range in between 0.2 and like 0.9. Things should never be pure black or pure white. So something like this, you can see it's pretty obvious I didn't add a roughness map variation to this particular piece here. You can figure out what piece that is pretty quickly by just doing the flick test. So the shinier metal bit did not get any kind of roughness variation. We'll bump it up and make some really quick. Oops. See, it's already lagging my computer too, but that is what it is. And I like clouds, so we'll just go with clouds too. Scale it up, check the mask. Adjust this. Okay. And everything needs to be relative. So we know that this bit is going to be our second shiniest, or sorry, our second roughest. Our wheels are going to be our roughest because they're more of a stone kind of texture. And everything here, it looks pretty good. It's not super, super shiny or super, super matte. The wheels could use just a little bit less. You really have to try this stuff for yourself and just sort of get familiar with the process. Each one of your cases is going to be different. You're going to be using different generators. You're going to be using different grunges. But I hope this gives you an idea of the general process. Okay, we'll keep going. We'll check our metallic now. this looks a little bit funky. The wheels are missing any kind of metallic map. That's why it's showing up with this UV stuff. So we can go in and fix that. Wheels, we'll find our base for the wheels. Set them to metal and just set them to 0. Okay. These areas are showing gray metal values, that are in between. That's because of our blending modes where the edge damage is sort of falling off. It's not ideal. We should theoretically go in and fix it so that it's only affecting the areas where the paint has completely stripped off. There's no such thing as paint kinda stripped off. But for demonstration purposes, we'll kind of leave it there. You can see everything else. The reason it looks not fully metallic is because it's got stuff like dust and dirt sitting on top of it, right? And dust and dirt is not metallic. So stuff like this being gray, quote unquote, is okay, right? Our values in here are all still 0 and 1. Right, we can see where we might be missing normal details. Looks like there's a few areas. And we don't have any opacity or emissive. That's what we end up with. Something I would recommend you do, kind of as an aside, is sign your work in some capacity. It doesn't have to be anything crazy, but it does just help mark your stuff as yours. If you find like an inner corner like this, all right, we could stencil something totally different. Your initials, maybe.
What are your initials dash the date?
You could do that too. Ideally, it's something organic. That's a nice way to do it. We can refresh this. And we can just go back to our same indent layer, paint, add our stencil. Gotta come in, paint it on. Or not. Is this the right layer? Oh, it's not the right layer, that's why. Imprints, this is our layer. Not super necessary, this part, but it does help separate your work as your own, and you can always find it and make sure it's yours. And it just makes it more fun to actually work on this stuff. Okay, cool. Any final questions? This was a bit different. I didn't really go through any step-by-step or theory in the slides. I just wanted to sort of go through this with you and hope that you would kind of try it yourself in some capacity. Next week it'll be back to more slide-focused, concept-based stuff. But for this, you kind of got to get a feel for it, if I'm honest. I hope you give it a shot over the next week. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to reach out. But that's all I have for you today. Unless, did anyone have any questions about anything particular I did here, if they want to recreate it themselves or anything like that? Cool. Then I think you can all...
Did you show how to work on the 2D texture rather than just the mesh itself?
I showed with the imprinting of this. Yeah, it works just like blenders, where if you have your UVs lined up a lot better on the UV map, it's a lot easier to line things up.
Yeah, like not inheriting like object scale or whatever, so the brush stays the same size throughout the whole 2D section. So, like,
There's that
that's
too.
really helpful for random for like weird edges, because the brush might like suddenly like grow and shrink.
That's also fair, yeah. So in Substance Painter, what happens here is your brush will actually change depending on what surface you're hovering over. That's why you kind of see it like bouncing around so much. Like sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small. It does do its best to sort of stay consistent throughout each surface. But sometimes it can kind of mess up.
Yeah. It's just like when working on the 2D side though, because as you move the brush, it'll inherit the scale of whatever surface it's on. So when you, like, say you're texturing a part that's like the UV is around, it'll like shrink as it goes over the edge. And so you can.
I don't know if mine does that. Yeah, mine does not do that. I was gonna say I've never.
Flat-edged object
It could depend. All of my, I don't think this is a great object for it because
Yeah.
the UVs are going to be super duper flat. The only one I can think of is like this one here, which is this edge.
Yeah, I'm going to be
Yeah.
very round right now. So as I move it over like a surface, it's like growing and shrinking.
That could be a new thing. I don't really know. Yeah, as far as I know, my brush does not do that though.
You go to the paint settings on your properties. You want to see what your brush settings are. Scroll down.
They're all
Oh
default.
yeah, so it is on tangent rep and so the size space is still subobject. So like UVs, if you really don't want it to, if you want to just do 2D work, use the alignment UV and then size space texture and the brush color line change size. No matter where you are on your 2D texture, it's like even if your islands are like improperly scaled in 3D space, it's still shrink.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, that could be part of it because this is all textile density even,
Yeah.
which ideally everybody else's is too, and then that shouldn't come up. But yeah. Cool. There's lots of little things to play around with. There's a ton of different stuff here. Aiden?
When would you use Substance Designer as opposed to Substance Paint?
For this stuff, you wouldn't.
Okay.
That's going to be for environments. We're doing that later. So when we need tiling textures, you can use tiling textures you make within here as a base, but generally speaking, that's going to be for like your environments where you've got so much space to cover and to keep it textile density even, right? So this prop we made textile density even, where every pixel on it is roughly the same across the entire mesh, right? That's because we have enough texture space here in this 1/4K map to make that happen for an object of this scale. And we're only working within this object. As soon as we add like, I don't know, a building that's got like 10 meters of space to cover across a texture, we can't use a 16K map to individually texture that building, right? So we have to use tiling textures and overlay them on top of each other to hide the fact they're tiling and build up those bigger spaces. And Substance Designer is really good for authoring materials for that kind of thing.
Okay.
So Superior is going to show you an alternative method for texturing. I don't know if it's this week. I think this week you're doing the process I just did, but for grades for his assignment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I think the week after that, he'll be showing how to texture using a different method, which is photo scanning. So it's very similar to what I've done, but instead of where you're making the different properties of the material bit by bit, you're using existing photographs, making them tile, and then doing the like PBR stuff on top of it. It's just a different method, different workflow. He'll show it to you in a couple weeks though. Yeah, that's it. Okay, cool. Thanks everyone.